A child's haunting experience. The laughter from the locked playroom. Imagine being a child with a heart condition, constantly in and out of the hospital, spending days and nights in sterile, quiet rooms, surrounded by the beeping of machines and the distant murmur of nurses' footsteps. The hospital was a second home for me, and while I had grown used to the routines, the nurses checking in, the doctors visiting with their charts, the constant hum of fluorescent lights, there was always an eerie stillness at night that made sleep feel like an impossible task. When I was young, I had a serious heart condition that required frequent hospital stays. At first, the whole experience was frightening and overwhelming, but over time, the doctors, nurses, and the routine of hospital life became familiar. However, as much as I got used to the physical side of my illness, the nights at the hospital were always unsettling. There was something about the stillness of the night, the loneliness of being in a room surrounded by medical equipment that never felt right. One particular night stands out vividly in my memory, a night I can never quite explain. It was around 3 a.m., a time when most of the hospital seemed to be asleep. The corridors were dark and the only light came from the moon filtering through the small window in my room. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep but unable to find rest, as I often did in the hospital. My body was too accustomed to the chaos of medical procedures and IV drips to truly relax. Then I heard it. At first it was faint, like a distant murmur that I could almost convince myself was my imagination. But as I listened more closely, the sounds became clearer. Laughter. It wasn't the laughter of adults or the nurses chatting as they made their rounds. No, this was unmistakably the laughter of children, bright, carefree, and full of energy. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The laughter sounded like it was coming from the playroom just across the hall from my room. The playroom was usually locked at night, as it was only meant for the younger patients during the day. But this laughter, it seemed so real, so vibrant, as if a group of children were inside, playing, laughing, having fun. And yet, I knew the playroom was empty. It had to be. I listened more intently, my heart pounding in my chest. The laughter continued for a few minutes, echoing in the quiet hall. It sounded like the children were running around, laughing, playing games, and shouting to each other. I even thought I heard a ball bounce against the walls. But that couldn't be possible. The playroom had been locked since the evening, and there were no children allowed to play at that time of night. I tried to shake it off. It had to be a trick of the mind, right? Maybe it was the sound of the hospital's old plumbing or a strange echo from somewhere else. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something wasn't right. Why would I hear children's laughter at 3 a.m. when the entire hospital was asleep? The hospital was quiet at night, save for the sounds of machines and the occasional footsteps of a nurse checking in. But children's laughter, that was something else. Unable to ignore the strange noise any longer, I mustered the courage to call out to the nurse on duty. I pressed the call button and waited, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be causing this bizarre noise. When the nurse entered, I asked her if there were any children in the playroom at that hour. She looked at me with a slightly confused expression and answered, "No, the playroom is locked at night. The only kids who are here are in their rooms, and they should be asleep." The nurse didn't seem concerned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The laughter had been so real, so vivid, and it wasn't just in my imagination. It felt like there was something in the hospital, something unexplainable. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the laughter I'd heard. I asked some of the other patients and their families if they had ever heard anything strange during the night. That's when I learned that I wasn't the only one. Other patients had heard it too. Some spoke of hearing children playing in the hallways at odd hours, while others described the laughter coming from the playroom. It wasn't just the occasional sound of a child's voice. It was the unmistakable sound of children's laughter, full of life and joy, echoing in the empty, silent halls. And what struck me as even more disturbing was that no one had seen the children. No one could explain where the laughter came from. Eventually, I learned that there had been several reports over the years of strange occurrences like this in the hospital. The nurses had a saying, "The children never leave." Some believed that the hospital had been built on land where a children's ward once stood, long before the current building was constructed. Others thought it had something to do with the spirits of children who had passed away during their hospital stays, their laughter lingering in the halls as an echo of their lost lives. As the years passed, I became more accustomed to these strange happenings, but they never ceased to unsettle me. I'd often lie awake at night, listening to the whispers of children, the laughter, or sometimes even the faint sound of footsteps running through the halls. I could never fully explain what I had experienced, but the strange occurrences seemed to be a constant in the hospital. It was as if the hospital itself held on to its past, memories of children who had once filled the halls with life, now forever echoing in the empty spaces. It wasn't just my imagination or the side effects of medication. These occurrences were real, and I knew I wasn't alone in hearing the laughter. Other patients, some of them adults, had also experienced it, and it was always at the same time, 3 a.m., the witching hour when the hospital was at its quietest. Now, whenever I visit a hospital, even as an adult, I can't help but think of those late nights I spent in that old, eerie building. I wonder if the children's laughter is still heard in the halls, if the playroom still holds their playful spirits, and if the nurses still tell new patients, "The children never leave." It's a strange comfort, knowing that the laughter of those children lives on, even after all these years, in the place where they once played. Maybe it's just a part of the hospital now, an unexplainable part of its soul. And maybe, just maybe, the children who once filled those halls are still out there, playing, laughing, and waiting for someone to hear their joyful sound in the dead of night. The Haunted House, a teen's terrifying encounter in an old hospital. It was supposed to be the start of a new chapter for our family. We had just moved into an old, sprawling house on the outskirts of town. At first glance, it seemed like any other house, large, full of character, with rooms that felt spacious and full of possibilities. But there was something off about it, something that lingered just beneath the surface, something that made me uneasy every time I walked through its creaky doors. I was 14 at the time, and though I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, I couldn't shake the feeling that this house was different. We had been told by the realtor that it was once a hospital, decades ago. The history behind it wasn't something anyone really talked about, but the house itself seemed to whisper its past to anyone who dared to listen. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but the strange sounds and inexplicable events that happened shortly after we moved in made me question everything I thought I knew. At first, the oddities were subtle. I would hear footsteps echoing down the hallway when I was alone, or the distant sound of doors creaking open in the middle of the night. I tried to ignore it. Silly things. Probably just the house settling, I convinced myself. But then it started to get worse. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I was lying in my room trying to fall asleep. It was around midnight when I heard it. A knock. Not just any knock, but a loud, deliberate knock. I sat up, my heart racing. It was coming from my window, but when I looked, there was no one there. No wind, no sign of anything unusual. Just a dark, still night outside. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had brushed against the glass, or maybe I had imagined it. But then, just as I was about to lie back down, I heard it again, louder this time, as though someone had knocked directly on the window. I jumped out of bed, rushed to the window, and threw open the blinds. Still, no one. Nothing. The yard was empty. It was the kind of silence that seemed to press down on you, suffocating any thoughts of rational explanation. The next day, I tried to brush it off. After all, houses make strange noises, especially old ones. Maybe it was just the wind, maybe a loose shutter banging against the window. But that night it happened again. This time it wasn't just knocks. It was something far worse. I was sitting in the living room reading a book when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate steps. They seemed to be coming from upstairs, but my parents were out, and I was home alone. I stood frozen, listening as the footsteps moved closer and closer until they were directly above me. I felt my heart race as I slowly climbed the stairs, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Each step creaked under my feet as I moved toward the source of the noise. But when I reached the top of the stairs, everything stopped. The house fell silent again. My skin prickled with the sense that I wasn't alone. I checked each room. Nothing. No one there. The house was empty, just as it should have been. But the strangest part, the next morning I found a series of scratches on the floor of my bedroom, as if something, or someone, had dragged itself across the floor during the night. The marks were faint, but they were there. It was impossible to ignore. I didn't know what to think. I kept it to myself, afraid I'd sound crazy if I told anyone. But my younger brother, who had been staying in a room down the hall, came to me one evening, his face pale and trembling. He admitted that he had heard the same knocks and footsteps. But there was more. He swore that one night he had woken up to see a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed, just standing there, watching him. I knew my brother wasn't one to make things up. He had always been the skeptical one, the one who laughed off ghost stories. And yet, here he was, telling me he had seen something that couldn't be explained. That was when I realized that the strange happenings weren't just limited to me. As the weeks went by, things only got worse. The knocks grew more frequent, always coming at odd hours of the night. Sometimes they would come from the windows. Other times they would sound like they were coming from the walls themselves. And the footsteps? They seemed to follow me wherever I went, always just behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one there. One night, I decided to confront whatever was causing these disturbances. Armed with a flashlight, I walked around the house, checking every room, every closet, and even the attic. But each time I thought I found the source of the noise, it was just another empty room. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air grew thick and heavy, and I felt eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anyone. That was when I found something I hadn't expected. In the attic, beneath a dusty old tarp, was a stack of old photographs. I flipped through them, and my hands froze when I saw a picture of the house. Back when it had been a hospital. There were nurses in old-fashioned uniforms, and in the background I could see patients lying in beds, some of them appearing to be quite ill. But what struck me the most was one particular photo. In the corner of the image there was a shadowy figure standing by the door. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I studied it, I realized it was a person, dressed in clothes that didn't belong to any of the hospital staff. I quickly closed the album and left the attic, my heart pounding in my chest. Could this be connected to the strange events? Was there something or someone still lingering in this house? Despite the strange occurrences, we never found any logical explanation. We eventually moved out of the house, but the memories of the knocks, the footsteps, and that chilling photo stayed with me. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that old house. I don't know if it was a spirit, a ghost, or just some strange energy that had taken hold of the place. But I do know one thing for sure. Something in that house was trying to get our attention. Something that, no matter how hard we tried to ignore it, could not be explained. And as I look back, I can't help but wonder, did we unknowingly disturb something that had been resting for years? Or was it simply the house's past, echoing through time, trying to remind us of the many lives that had once passed through its walls? We may never know. But the mystery of the house remains unsolved, and the knocks to this day echo in my memory. The haunted hospital, a mother's terrifying experiences at a former community college. It's funny how certain places, despite their modern-day purpose, can carry echoes of their past. My mom's job at the local hospital was supposed to be a safe and stable one. She had always worked in healthcare, but this particular hospital had an odd reputation, mostly whispered rumors and strange stories shared by the staff. It used to be a community college, but when the hospital opened, the building's past wasn't forgotten. Instead, it seemed to bleed through the walls. It wasn't long before my mom realized that something darker and far more chilling lingered within those walls. I remember how she used to talk about her days at work, sometimes with a sense of exhaustion, other times with an unspoken sense of dread. At first, I thought it was just the nature of her job. Hospitals aren't the happiest of places after all. But the stories she started telling me, they weren't just about patients or long shifts. They were stories about things that shouldn't exist in the real world. One night, after coming home from a late shift, she finally told me what had been haunting her for weeks. She had seen a ghost. It happened late one evening when she was walking down the long, dimly lit hallway of the hospital. It was a stretch of corridor that no one really liked to walk alone, but that night, she was alone. As she moved down the hallway, a flicker of movement caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a child running through the corridor, but when she turned to look, there was no one in sight. She shrugged it off, maybe a nurse's child running around. But as she continued walking, she saw it again. A little girl, no older than 5 or 6, standing at the far end of the hallway, staring at her with wide, vacant eyes. My mom's heart stopped. The girl was wearing an old-fashioned white dress, the kind that looked as though it had come straight from a past era, and her hair hung in messy tangles around her face. She tried to call out to the girl, but the words caught in her throat. The little girl didn't move or speak. She just stood there, her eyes unblinking and unsettling. My mom slowly took a few steps forward, but before she could say anything, the girl vanished. One moment, she was there, and the next, she was gone, as if she had never existed at all. Shaken, my mom turned and hurried back to the nurse's station, but the eerie feeling lingered. She didn't tell anyone that night. No one would believe her, she thought. But as the days went on, she started to hear whispers from her colleagues. Others had seen the same little girl in different parts of the hospital, a child wandering the hallways, never speaking, never acknowledging anyone. Some believed it was the spirit of a child who had died in the building when it was still a college, while others thought she was just a figment of collective imagination. But to my mom, the encounter felt all too real. This wasn't the last time she would have an encounter with the supernatural in the hospital, though. A few months later, she had an experience so terrifying, it nearly pushed her to quit. It happened one night when she was asked to cover a late shift in the hospital's morgue. It was a job she had done before, nothing out of the ordinary, just paperwork and making sure the deceased were properly accounted for. But this night felt different. There was an oppressive silence in the morgue, and the air felt heavier than usual. As she was organizing some files, she noticed something strange. The room's lights flickered, casting long shadows on the cold metal tables where the bodies were laid out. She froze, feeling a sudden chill crawl up her spine. It was almost as if the air had shifted, and there was a presence, something that made her skin prickle. She dismissed it as nothing, probably just the lights, or maybe she was tired. But then the temperature in the room dropped drastically. My mom could see her breath, thin plumes of vapor hanging in the air. She stepped back, unnerved, when she heard a noise. At first, it sounded like a faint scratching coming from one of the morgue drawers. Then the scratching grew louder, more frantic, as though someone, or something, was trying to escape. Terrified, my mom rushed over to the drawer, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood there for a moment, gathering the courage to open it. But as her hand reached for the handle, the noise suddenly stopped. The room was deathly silent again. Reluctantly, she opened the drawer, half expecting to find something or someone alive inside. But there was nothing. No body, no explanation, just the cold metal and emptiness. Still shaken, she turned to leave the morgue, but as she did, she felt a hand gently brush against her shoulder. Her heart skipped a beat, and she spun around, expecting to see one of her colleagues behind her. But no one was there. She was alone, completely alone. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she hurried out of the morgue, her footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. The feeling of being watched lingered with her for the rest of the night, and she couldn't shake the sensation that something was following her, something that didn't belong in this world. The experiences became too much to bear. The strange sounds, the eerie figures, the sense of constant unease. It wore on her. Each night it seemed as though the paranormal occurrences grew stronger, more intense. Finally, after another unsettling night shift, my mom came home and announced she was quitting her job at the hospital. She simply couldn't take it anymore. Later, she would tell me that she was certain the building was haunted. The hospital may have been modernized, but the old college's foundation had never truly been erased, and whatever spirits lingered in those walls had found their way into the hospital's present. My mom wasn't the only one who experienced these strange happenings either. Other staff members had reported hearing voices, seeing fleeting shadows, and feeling an unshakable presence. The ghost of the little girl was often seen in the same hallway, and sometimes she would appear at the windows, staring out into the night as if waiting for someone. Eventually, the hospital would be renovated again, and the morgue would be relocated. But the stories didn't end there. Whispers continued to spread about a haunted hospital, a ghostly little girl, and a terrifying experience that drove a mother to walk away from her job. To this day, my mom refuses to drive past that building, and she never speaks of it without a shiver running down her spine. As for the little girl, I still wonder, was she a spirit lost in time, or was there something more to her presence in that haunted building? Perhaps one day someone else will uncover the truth. But for now, the mystery remains, as does the unsettling memory of my mom's terrifying experiences.